go. We will have a PowerPoint video presentation. It's a very large file. So that has been the cause of our slight delay. I think we're here. We can get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Jim Cavallaro. I teach here, and I direct the International Human Rights and Conflict Resolution Clinic. But what matters today is I also direct the new Stanford Human Rights Center. And we are in the midst of a year-long series, a year-long as in the year 2013, on the future of human rights. The first event in this series was a few weeks back. Ken Roth, the Executive Director of Human Rights Watch, spoke on the future of human rights and pressuring rights violators and developing context and new balance of power. What I'd like to do before we present our second speaker in the series, and I mean that just in terms of temporal order, Sam Gregory, who's here to my right, to your left. Before we do that, I'd just like to run through and remind you of the upcoming events and invite you to come to them. They will be lunchtime talks, and we anticipate having lunch at the lunchtime talks. So hopefully we will have you all return. April 22nd, and let me note also, this talk, as in, like the last talk was on a Tuesday, but the next several talks will be on Monday. So the next talk will be our own Professor Jenny Martinez on April 22nd, who will address the question of, does the history of human rights matter for the future? On April 29th, Paul Hoffman, who is one of the nation's premier alien tort statute litigators and also lead counsel in the leading case Kyoble versus Royal Dutch Petroleum, will speak on human rights litigation in U.S. courts after Kyoble. We know that Kyoble is about to be decided by the Supreme Court. On May 6th, Balakrishnan Rajagopal, Professor of Law and Development at MIT and also the Director of the MIT Program on Human Rights and Justice, will speak about the future of human rights, the rise of the South. And on May 13th, Ejim Dike, who is the Executive Director of the U.S. Human Rights Network, will address the question, can U.S. social movements leverage international human rights standards? So I think we have a very, very solid series of talks for the spring quarter. We'll pick up again in the fall quarter and run through the end of 2013, again on the topic, the future of human rights. I anticipate, I don't want to put him on the spot, but we also anticipate that around May 18th or 17th or the 20th, that visiting Professor Cesar Rodriguez Gararito, who is here with us, will also give a talk, and we're working out the details and also the topic, but I'm sure you'll want to come to that as well. So today, let me present our speaker, Sam Gregory. He is the program director at Witness, which is an organization very much on the cutting edge of video and human rights. At Witness, Sam leads the Cameras Everywhere initiative, as you can see, which is focused on empowering people to use video effectively, safely, and ethically. He's an internationally recognized visionary in the field of new media and advocacy. He's a graduate of the University of Oxford and completed his master's in public policy at the Kennedy Memorial as a Kennedy Memorial Scholar at Harvard. He's on the board of the U.S. Campaign for Burma and the advisory board of Games for Change. He also teaches human rights and participatory media as a lecturer at the Harvard Kennedy School. Finally, let me mention that Sam has been involved in the launch of the Human Rights YouTube channel, which has recently been nominated for a Webby Award in the Best of the Web in the category Public Interest Online Channels. And I can tell you that you can log on to vote at webbyawards.com. Generally, it's considered bad form to have your computers open during a talk. However, if you are using your computer to log on to webbyawards.com to vote for the Human Rights YouTube channel, that would be looked on kindly. So Sam's talk today poses the question, can citizen witnesses and technology empower rights advocacy? I'm very much looking forward to hearing from you, as I know all of us are, and please join me in welcoming Sam Gregory to Stanford Law School.
thank you, Jim, and thank you also, Clara and Ada, for the invitation to be here and organizing that. So what I hope to do is give you a little bit of a sense of some answers and questions around this topic here. What I thought I'd do to start with, though, is talk a little bit about my own personal narrative to engaging with this. And I was sparked to think about this actually quite recently because last autumn, Aung San Suu Kyi, who was the Burmese democracy leader and now an opposition politician in Burma, came to Washington, D.C. to receive the Congressional Gold Medal. It's the highest civilian honor the U.S. can give, given to very few people. It was given in the Capitol building in D.C. I was lucky enough to have an invite there. So standing in the hallway outside, I met Aung San Suu Kyi, and the first thing I did was take a photo and upload it to Instagram. And it set me thinking a little bit about the strange way in which my own involvement with a country like Burma had moved along over the trajectory of about 20 years. And so it's over 20 years ago, but in 1988, there was this happening in the streets of Burma. August 8th, 1988, the government repressed student and opposition protests in the streets of Rangoon, Yangon, the capital city of Burma, now called Myanmar. And for years afterwards, and I saw this clip when I was a teenager, I guess, mid-teens, 1988. And for years afterwards, when I became a professional human rights advocate and involved in movements around Burma, people would say, do you have that clip of footage from '88? There was one clip of footage that everyone was trying to track down, which had been shot by NHK, Japanese channel. So everyone was always saying, do you have access to that clip? The one clip that shows what happened. Fast forward to 2007. I remained very involved in the democracy movement in Burma. And many of you may remember this. It was a very visual moment of the monks marching in the streets of Yangon. And in that time, in 2007, there were these people called the VJs. And you might have seen a film called Burma VJ, which was all about these people who had been trained to document. They were not quite journalists, they weren't quite professional activists, but they were filming in the streets. A lot of their footage shot on cell phones, on small cameras. And at that point, I was working a lot with groups who were documenting violence in the eastern part of Burma against ethnic minorities. And then, a couple of years ago, we had the start of what hopefully is a transition to democracy in Burma, an election that wasn't quite democratic, but did open up for a more civilian parliament. And I got a visa to go to Burma for the first time in 20 years of work on Burma. And I had the opportunity to be here, standing outside the gates of Aung San Suu Kyi's house, which is sort of in relatively close to central Yangon, when President Obama visited. And the thing that struck me, and you can kind of see it in the photo here, was everyone holding up their cell phones, their smartphones, and trying to document this moment. And of course, I was one of them. I was trying to film it, I was trying to take my photo. And I thought about that trajectory of those 88, that one clip of footage, everyone trying to get access to it, shot by a professional camera crew. 2007, these people who are kind of on the edge between being professional human rights advocates and ordinary citizens, committed ordinary citizens. And then here, where you have all these people just filming because it's part of daily life. And I suspect none of them were really uploading that as news value, they're going to share it. I left this moment on a tremendous high. And in the 6 months since, I've been following other events in Burma. And this is the flip side of this kind of sort of where we're at now. It's events like this in Rakhine State, which is the northwest part of Burma. Some of you may have followed it. There have been attacks on the Muslim minority, or Muslims, and on a largely Muslim minority in Burma. And there's not a lot of video of that. There's not a lot of people documenting. And I think this is really important as a framing question, is that there are plenty of places, and I bet everyone in this room has a smartphone, or 80% of the people in this room have a smartphone. And in places like Burma, which we might think of as being, well, that's the developing world, there are a lot of people with devices, with connectivity. At the same time, very close to that, you have this absence. And so I want you to bear that in mind as I talk about the future of human rights. And I thought about this quote from William Gibson, which some of you may be familiar with. William Gibson, famous cyberpunk author. And I actually don't know if he ever said this quote. I actually couldn't track down actually when he's supposed to have said it, but it's a really good quote. The future is already here, it's not evenly distributed. And that's going to continue to be the way it is. So just as we look at the future, let's also remember that future is not evenly distributed. Okay. Let me talk a little bit about where I come from professionally and sort of my perspective, because obviously everyone's prognostications about where we're going come from where they start. A lot of that is rooted, you heard about my personal sort of starting point in Burma activism as a teenager. My professional standpoint is in this moment. Are people familiar with that? What's being captured there? This is the Rodney King incident. Now, that's actually a really interesting trick question that I've asked in different settings. Because if you ask an audience of people who are over 35, almost anywhere in the world, people have some sense of this. If you ask an audience under 25, there's a good chance you might not have, because this is 1991. The reason I show it is this was a very iconic moment in the US. It was a moment that was all about exposing the reality of police violence and racial discrimination. So Rodney King was an African-American man, stopped in a police stop in LA, and then beaten by the police with what was unjustifiable force, over 50 blows. Now, the reason it's relevant to this conversation is that it was filmed by what I would describe as a citizen witness. It's a man called George Holliday, who from his balcony, and it's, the footage is shaky, it's not very good quality, picked up a camera that he probably purchased for his own family use, and he filmed this event. And it was then shared, it was put on news video, ultimately became part of the trial of the police officers, both the prosecution and, of course, the defense, because both of them picked over it. It was also the starting point for the organization where I work, which is an organization called Witness. We were created after this incident. And the reason we were created was to say, there is this tremendous potential at this intersection between the power of using video and the ability to capture in moving images human rights violations, and the capacity of individuals, both people like George Holliday, but also human rights activists in a more professional role, to do that more purposefully. I'm not going to talk much about what Witness has been working on for the last 20 years. If you go to our website, you can look at it. Lots of interesting campaigns, things we've worked on. A little bit of a sense of that sort of summary, so you understand the context. We've worked pretty much globally. I think we've worked with human rights groups in every continent, and we're basically premised on the idea, how do you support existing movements for activism, for change, to do their work better? First with video, and now increasing at that intersection of video, plus mobile devices, plus technology. It's really hard to separate those out from each other. And to give you a feel of people we've worked with, there's a short clip here I'll share. So we've worked with many of the groups you see in that context, and some of the images are very iconic there, on a whole range of types of ways of using video, from evidence to community organizing to decision-maker lobbying. But I want to look at where we're trying to move to next and what we've been thinking about in the last year or two. And I think some of that reality is captured by this slide, which is a slide I stumbled on when I was watching a promotional video from YouTube about a year ago. Must have been a year ago. And it was like a 3-minute video celebrating how wonderful YouTube is. They do them every now and again. It's kind of like a massive sort of self-congratulation about everyone who's involved in YouTube. This one was really interesting because it captured a reality that I think we encounter around human rights video, which is, yes, there's a video like Coney 2012 that got 100,000 views, got there much quicker than almost any even sort of social humor video, got there much quicker than a lot of the sort of iconic viral videos we think about. At the same time, most human rights video fits into this category, the category that was just 2 seconds later in that video, the 72 hours of video uploaded per minute. That number is inaccurate now, it's actually 96 hours, the last time I asked someone there. And even if you think of 0.1% of that as being social purpose, that is a heck of a lot of video. So I think it's useful to think about those two framings when we think about this question of citizen video, video and human rights. Yes, there's Kony 2012, and we can talk about those in a Q&A, but actually that's not all that representative of the vast majority of the video that is being created, either as just raw documentation or as advocacy. Some drivers behind that. I mentioned before that Witness itself has evolved from being focused just on video to this kind of intersection of video and mobile and internet. One reason for that is this transition. This is a graph that represents this. That between now and 2016, there's likely to be a 120-fold increase in the number of people who use a gigabyte of data a month worldwide. Now, why this is important is a gigabyte of data is essentially someone who creates and shares video. So the context we're in, and so I showed the 96 hours, the second context is a continuing expansion of that. So I think as we think about context to think about how people create human rights video, you need to look at the context of how people create video or create media themselves. So I find this number pretty horrifying and shocking in its size, because it means we're going from 0.5% of people who use a gigabyte of data. Again, this room might be unrepresentative in that respect, to 60% of people using that, of mobile users. Now, lest we think that's something that is very US specific, that is also a trend generally, globally. This is some figures from the Middle East and North Africa, which see a 36 times increase in mobile data traffic in the same 5 years. And I often think about statistics like from 2011, within 6 months of Huawei, a big Chinese manufacturer, launching a $80 smartphone in Kenya, they sold 350,000 of them. So the numbers of which, the way in which people snap up cheap mobile devices is very rapid. Another context, I'm not going to go through the figures here. I just want you to think about that this sort of general volume question. And the final line here is perhaps most important when we think about internet traffic, the concept of the zettabyte. Does anyone know how much a zettabyte is? We have no computer engineers here in the room. I think it's smaller than a yottabyte, for those who are keeping score. No, I had it explained to me that a zettabyte is the amount of visual information conveyed from the eyes to the brain of the entire human race in a single year, in terms of internet traffic. So just volume, super important to think of here, 20 billion DVDs by 2015 in terms of annual traffic. So let's take this back to a human rights context. Okay, we've got a lot of volume here, only increasing, trend that is not going to change. That's a kind of technical question. That's all about the numbers. Let's think of it in human terms. And this is the increasing sort of range and diversity of people who are part of this ecosystem of creating the human rights part of it. So that 0.1% of that 96 hours. And one of the things we see, and I think this is important for trying to think through where the future goes in terms of human rights advocacy, is a diversification of the people who are trying to become part of, say, a human rights ecosystem, who are trying to contribute to documenting things, sharing them, advocating. So this slide just kind of tries to capture a few of the people who we might find in that ecosystem. The one in the top left actually is George Holliday, the guy I mentioned before, who filmed the Rodney King incident. And for me, he's kind of like the citizen witness, the guy who saw it, who filmed it, who put it out there 20 years ago, 24 years ago actually at this point, goodness, 23, 20, 21 years ago, can't even count, 22 years ago, got on the final slide. You can see why I became a human rights advocate, not a mathematician or an economist. I think his parallels are actually in the people in the Occupy movement, that next slide across, or the people in Tahrir Square, or in the similar movements of the Arab revolutions. They're the people who would not have anticipated 6 months ago, probably, that they would be part of an ecosystem documenting police brutality or misconduct. There are still many people who do this within a formal framework. A lot of Witness's work is with formal NGOs and social movements. Man in the top right is a documenter from Mexico we've worked with closely, who works in a social movement documenting abuses related to dam construction. Here in the left, activists in Kenya documenting land rights. But as we move on, we get into sort of new forms of people participating. This is an interesting one here, the Facebook page of the Syrian revolution. So if you're trying to find information about what is going on in Syria now, you might well go to this page, which aggregates together all of the sort of the flows and feeds from the Syrian documenters on the ground in many cities in Syria. Other players we might want to think about. One area that we come across a lot, and this is disturbing, is a lot of this ecosystem of this sort of documentation is actually shot by the perpetrators. So again, we shouldn't assume that people document purely for good reasons. In fact, this came up for a conversation that I was having with Jim before is, when do we think of these people as positive witnesses and when are they negative witnesses, people who are doing it for all the wrong reasons? And does that matter actually once it enters the ecosystem? This is a really interesting clip here. This is a clip shot by Egyptian police of themselves abusing the driver of an informal bus in Cairo. So someone who hadn't probably paid a bribe, done the right things. And they filmed on their cell phones and they circulated it as a way to humiliate him. That clip then, of course, got repurposed by other people into evidence of human rights violations. So it became one of the things that helped drive one of the movements that led up to the Arab Spring in Egypt, which was a movement around police brutality that dated back to the mid-noughties, 2007, as people said, wait a second, how is it that we can see this circulating and we're not doing anything about it? Like the police is actually documenting the evidence of their own violations and sharing it, and we are not reacting as a public. Can't really see this slide too well here. This is my good friend Sandrine, and she I follow her on Facebook, and I think she follows me unless she got sick of me. And one of the things that's interesting here is that clearly in this sort of population of people, only about 1% or 2% are creators still. But you have this tremendous role of the sharers. And I think it's really interesting to look and think about your own Facebook or Twitter or Instagram feeds. With Sandrine, I follow her because she shares pictures of her cute children. Like I like looking at those in the Facebook feed, I like commenting on them. But once every 5 or 6, she puts in footage of forced evictions in Paris, because she's Parisian, she cares about human rights. So I'm encountering human rights footage in a way that I probably wouldn't have 10 years ago, in a way that's kind of embedded in my daily life. Because I follow Sandrine because she's my friend, and I follow the range of her interests, and I'm just encountering that in a pattern. So I think it's really important to also pay attention to that sort of corner of this ecosystem of what people are creating. The ways this gets deployed, this kind of ecosystem of footage, very varied. I'm going to talk about some of these usages as we go forward. And they vary from the very judicial, the top left, in someone like the International Criminal Court, through to community organizing, both in ways that are virtual. So in the middle you have like the hashtags, which are the virtual organizing you can do around a Twitter feed. And of course physical organizing, which is equally important, which might be in the DRC Congo here. It might be in Mexico, as in the top right. It might be in the streets of New York around a General Assembly at Occupy. So there's a very diverse number of ways in which people are engaging with this material. I'm going to put out 3 questions that we've been grappling with as we look ahead, as ways to frame a set of challenges that we're dealing with. Now, this is the first of them. We have this growing number of people, which is growing in absolute numbers and growing in diversity. So how do you support them to do this, as Jim said, as he described the initiative I work on, to do it as impactfully, safely, and ethically as possible? Because they're not the same people as who would have been necessarily part of Human Rights Watch's staff 10 years ago, Amnesty staff 10 years ago. They may not even be the same people who were part of an Amnesty group or chapter 5 years ago or 2 years ago. This is a huge question, the question of that abundance. I'm going to frame it as abundance rather than overload, but I think you could frame it either way, right? You have too many images, too many data points, too many sources. Now, let's remember, this is not a challenge that is unique to human rights. And so I don't know where you are in the room, what professional backgrounds you are coming from or entering into, but this is a challenge that is also being faced in the news industry, right? Which is this question of like lots of information, how do we sort out who we're engaging with? And I think that's one of those interesting things as a human rights practitioner now is to say, how do we learn from parallel fields? How do we learn from the news industry? How do we learn from the way environmentalists monitor situations? And then this third question, which I think is equally important from an ethical point of view at a macro level, which is if you assume that there is going to be more and more information, there are still going to be situations like that situation in North Burma I described, where there aren't many images, there aren't many people documenting, or it might be a situation that's harder to capture in the terms we often think about visually. Maybe it's something that is not about what you can capture in 30 seconds of video. And this takes us back to really the mistake of Rodney King is, it led to an assumption by everyone that you could then just, hey, if we just get out a camera and film something, we'll be able to show what happens. Well, of course, the reality is many human rights issues are structural, they're not so visible, and that remains an issue, right? If we're concerned about the whole range of human rights issues, not just narrowly conceived civil and political rights or war crimes, but the range that includes social, economic, cultural rights, how do we grapple with that? So I want to talk through 5 specific challenge and opportunity sets. And I'm going to share a couple of things we're working on in those, but I'm also going to just put out kind of what we see as a problem set there that needs to be grappled with. And I'll spend a little bit of time on each of them. So broadly speaking, this question of skills, of trust, of the information management, of consent and privacy and safety. And then what I often think of as unseen protagonists. And by that I mean YouTube, or Twitter, or Facebook. But I also mean your mobile provider, or the governments that are making decisions about how the internet is governed. Because we don't see them, but they are actually structurally making decisions that affect our ability to hold up a camera, use our skills, try and protect our identities, try and conquer this overwhelming amount of information. So let's start with this challenge opportunity. I'm often sort of struck between whether to call these things challenges or opportunities. Since I'm on the West Coast, we should probably call them an opportunity. If I was on the East Coast, I'd call it a challenge. If I was in the UK, I would say this is a terrible dilemma. So I'm going to go West Coast on you for this one. Let me give an example of kind of like how we might, of some of the symptoms of this problem. And you're going to be able to relate to this because it's something that you grapple with on an everyday basis. So human rights in some cases is the extreme scenario of the situation we're all dealing with around information decision making. So about, probably, goodness, I'm trying to think, this was 18 months ago, this clip circulated during the context of the Ivory Coast civil conflict. So there was a disputed election in the Ivory Coast, a lot of violence, and a lot of also rhetoric online and sharing on social media. And this clip circulated, which appeared to show a man being burnt to death in the street. And the title said something like, genocide alert, more than 1,200 people burnt alive at Dweku by the pro-Ouattara. Ouattara was one of the 2 leaders of the factions. Terrible material circulating very rapidly online. One of my colleagues had run for a number of years a website we used to run, which is kind of like an early sort of version of YouTube for human rights called The Hub. And she said, wait a second, I saw this video before. This is actually a video that came from Kenya. And when it circulated from Kenya, it was described as witches being burnt. I actually don't know what the full kautal is, but 11 witches or 11 wizards being burnt alive. And exactly the same clip circulated with a different name in a different conflict. And so this is sort of a symptom of like one of the problems we have, which is a lot of information generated, a lot of information recycled, real problems of trust. Now, where do we find solutions to that? Okay, how do we deal with a problem like that? And I want to outline maybe 2 or 3 layers of solutions that we might want to think about. One is one that happens at the network level, which is we trust people to try and correct this as they go along. So let me show you a clip that came out of Bahrain early in the conflict there. Is it clear what happened there? What happened?
Fell down.
People fell down, okay. Do we know why they fell down? They were shot, yeah. So we know some things, right? So it's not, it's not like it's completely decontextualized. What was interesting about this, and this is when we start to think about how people create and sort of help verify this, was that very quickly afterwards, someone uploaded an annotation on YouTube and said, okay, click here if you want to see the after shooting video. This wasn't a human rights group that did this. This was people going, wait a second, we know that clip doesn't mean much to people. It looks like something terrible. They said, click here and you can see what comes next. And so if you click there, you saw this video. What that video told you was a couple more things. It told you, for example, that they weren't armed. If you looked at it, you could see that people weren't armed. It showed you better the location. It showed you eventually, I think there's another part of it which shows you like the tanks at the end. And it's funny, every time I've talked about this, people have said, well, actually there was another couple of clips that people were linked to. So it's like this ecosystem that very rapidly generated sort of self-organizing to try and prove what was happening. Now, that's a very sort of basic level approach to this problem of how we gather information. There are more structured ways to do it. In some contexts, this is Occupy, where often very purposefully people were thinking about multiple camera viewpoints. They would say, you need to get a camera here, in order to capture what happened. And then there are these people. This is something that's been very interesting in the last couple of years. And again, it goes to kind of who does what in this ecosystem of human rights. These are three people who I would describe as citizen curators. They're people who have taken it upon themselves to be the person who helps validate all these videos on YouTube. The interesting thing about it is none of them is a traditional human rights advocate. So the man in the top left is a guy called Elliot Higgins. He's also known as Brown Moses. And he's the person who has done a lot of work trying to work out which types of munitions are used in Syria. That's all he does, is look at videos and try and work out munition types. The guy in the top right is a guy called Onlymet. He's Mehdi Sahakiz. During the Green Revolution, if you wanted to find the most trusted videos on Iran, you went to his webpage, because he had looked through 3,000 videos and said, this one you can trust, this one you can't, this one you can. And this guy, people may know, Andy Carvin, was very well known in the US as someone who looked through and tweeted a lot of the material from the Arab Spring and verified it. What is interesting is, as I said, none of these is professional advocates. Each of them is developing their credibility to be able to sort through this because they've done it well and consistently over time in the space of YouTube, in the space of Facebook and Twitter. And one of the things that my organization has been looking at increasingly is how do you support these people? How do you support many, many different curators to help sort through this? This is not a technological solution. This is a solution about who fits where in this ecosystem of a lot of information. Because they do things like this. This was a video that Onlymet, that guy I indicated, found. You can see how many videos Onlymet had uploaded, close to 3,000. Onlymet is a graphic designer in New Jersey. He's the son of an Iranian political activist, but he lives in New Jersey. He's a graphic designer. And this was a video he had found which appeared to show pretty horrendous images of violence, bodies lined up in the street. And it's part of a remix video. And you've probably seen these kind of like remix videos of human rights. It's set to a song called Scream Till Freedom. It's just pounding images of violence set to this song. And there's this one image with these bodies in a row. And what Onlymet did was said, this isn't Iran. He put a screen on it when he shared it and said, this is probably, I think when I talked to him, he said it was Honduras in the 80s or something. And so again, he builds his credibility by being the person who actually steps in and says, I know you're all trying to create this momentum, you're trying to create documentation, but let's not step the ethical boundaries. Andy Carvin does this in a very public way on his Twitter stream. So for example, this is an example where during the Libyan conflict, there were these examples of a shell circulating, and people thought it had the Star of David on it. They thought that Israel had been supplying weapons to Gaddafi. You can imagine, of course, that kicked up a storm in the social media sphere. And so he worked with people to kind of like basically crowdsource discussion around this to identify where did this type of munitions come from, what was it. There's a long story around it. They didn't come from Israel. They're actually a type of sort of, trying to remember what sort of flare munition that came out of it. So these are sort of like these kind of people verifying in the social media system. One group that does that very formally is a group called Storyful. And if you're interested in trying to think about this sort of next generation of how we turn this volume of material into meaningful information, they look at videos and they do a combination of sort of more professionalized version of what I've just described. So these layers of ways of doing it. So for example, this video is a video that showed apparently bodies being dumped into a river quite early in the Syrian conflict. Horrendous, like people just being tossed off a bridge. And the question was, how do we work out whether this is true? Is it proof of what happened? Can we confirm it was the location? And so, for example, they did many of the things that I just described, which Andy Carvin or someone like do. So they talk to the sources, they talk to all this sort of traditional journalistic, but they also look at a Google map. and they look and see, does it look like that at the time of year? Because with Google Maps, you can go back and forth in time zones. Looked at satellite imagery. They looked at the credibility of the people who shared a clip. So for example, if someone had never shared something before, and they suddenly come up with a piece of compelling evidence, probably not a reliable source. Or maybe it is, if it's retweeted a lot, and if everyone who you do trust then shares that. Maybe that's just someone who's been anonymous before or wants to be anonymous that one time. And one of the interesting steps now is how this all gets turned into the right combination of algorithm and human. Because a lot of what we're talking about here in these dilemmas is, where does the human come in, where does the algorithm come in? We can talk more in Q&A about that where we hit that algorithm-human combination right. Storyful is one of the partners on the YouTube Human Rights channel, which Jim so gracefully promoted in the intro. I would encourage you to vote for it. I don't think we're going to win, but I really want you to vote for it. All the same, because it's a very interesting project. What it's trying to do is say, if you sit within YouTube and look at the footage that flows through YouTube, how do you try and give that context and meaning? How do you verify that? So we kind of sit inside YouTube and watch human rights footage flow through and try and say, can we verify some of this? Can we contextualize it? Because I think that's the other key, right? Is the contextualization. So Onlymet, when he contextualizes and says this isn't Iran, that's critical. The flip side of it might be to say, actually, this is Bahrain and this is what it shows. Or in the case of this playlist, these are alleged war crimes in Syria. Let's really talk through whether they are a war crime and are they true, right? There's two elements to it, right? Are they a war crime? Because people often say, well, it's a war crime. Well, maybe it isn't. Maybe that's just, that's evidence of something else. That might be a military encounter. And how do we verify it in public? So we're trying to model some of those approaches to how you think about that. We're not the only ones doing this. I think it's really interesting to see how groups like Human Rights Watch are also trying to build this into their methodologies. I know Ken came and spoke last week. And they've been looking at kind of these issues around cell phone photography and mapping. So it's this interesting question now of how do we get this sort of blend between what someone like Onlymet can do or someone else who curates a YouTube channel, and what was the role of the big human rights entities. Within this realm, one of the areas we've been paying a lot of attention to is actually the idea of evidence and social media. This is a very notorious clip from 2 or 3 years ago now, from Sri Lanka that circulated that appeared to show the extrajudicial execution of unarmed Tamils. This was at the end of the Sri Lankan army's takeover of the north of the island. It came from a cell phone, very little evidence around it. There was a very long process involving the UN Special Rapporteur on Extrajudicial Killings, looking at how do we verify this clip. Can we do it by looking at the metadata, the data underlying the video? Can we do it by verifying the blood splatter? Can we do it by verifying that there hasn't been a corruption of the video? And this sort of thing is really important as we start to think about how war crimes and human rights investigations happen going forward. Because there's kind of a coming storm of evidence. And what I mean by that is there were about 350,000 videos shot in Syria last year. Now, not all of them show evidence of war crimes, going back to the slide I showed before, but that's a lot of videos that potentially are evidence. And if you've been in a courtroom and tried to think about how that plays out, I don't know how many of you are lawyers and how many are non-lawyers, that idea of that volume of media can either be tremendously enticing or it can be tremendously scary in terms of how you think about how you manage that, present it, use it. And we've been engaging quite a lot with this issue in that context of international criminal justice. These are some of the questions that come up for us there. If anyone's in the legal side, I would love to talk more of you about that because we're really focused on trying to tease through how do you test out ideas like if you have 100 videos of the same incident, what is the best way to think about them as evidence? How do you sort of piece it together? And we can certainly step forward from the way it's currently done. I came across this reference, and I hope I haven't got this wrong. It's too wonderful a story for me not to use, but if anyone was involved with the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia, Jim, were you not in that context?
Never in their employ.
Never in their employ. So, but there was, basically, if you look through the transcripts of their process, they didn't transcribe videos, they just said video played, which I thought was this wonderful kind of sort of dismissal of this kind of whole source of evidence. It's kind of like, well, that was some sort of thing that they put on the screen and we don't want to look at it. That's not going to be possible moving forward because of this volume question and the way that, in fact, if you look at Syria, so much of the evidence, say, if we ever come to a national tribunal in Syria, is going to be these hundreds and thousands of videos. Let me talk a little bit about a project we've been working on that tries to address some of these. Again, a lot of the thinking that comes from my organization is where do you get the right mix between technology and human rights practice, and to some extent policy. One thing we've been working on is a tool called InformaCam, which looks at this sort of little trajectory of challenge. That when you see a piece of footage, you have this question, well, who created it? How did they create it? Who else was nearby? Who can corroborate it? And what's been the chain of custody? And interestingly, that's actually common to both law and news, right? If you're a news person, you're like, wow, I just got this awesome footage from Sierra Leone, but I don't know who shot it. I don't know if it was actually shot at that time. I can't find a corroborating source, and I don't know if it's been tampered with. So we've been trying to address that in tools building. And the way we do it is we've built a tool that enables you to, when you film on the mobile phone, it embeds all those types of data that might add to that. So it embeds, with your permission, because this is going to go to this delicate balance of privacy and data, the unique identity of your phone. I don't know if you know this, but the camera on your phone has a unique sensor identity. Not even just your phone identity, the camera on your phone, the pixel quality, the way it creates a photo is unique to it. So we embed that. We embed the data about how you move with your phone as you film. So for example, did you look left? At that point, did you see someone shooting? Did you look right? We embed GPS, and we embed things like Wi-Fi coordinates. As many of you will know, you can actually navigate by Wi-Fi coordinates in some places because they're almost like fixed points of identity. And we embed that all into the image as like a type of data. So if you think about it, you can then just watch how a piece of video played out in a particular setting, and you can also see if it's been tampered with. So we've been experimenting a lot in this area of how do you try and improve something at point of creation. So this is, for those who are familiar with metadata, metadata is the thing that is embedded in any image we take, and typically includes things like the name of the camera, the GPS. You can embed a lot more interesting things there if you think about it, and are thinking purposefully about why you want to gather that data. So I think, again, think about the technology and then think about how someone uses it. So this enables someone to better gather video, in this case for evidence, but standing alone as a technology, it probably won't step forward to that. Let me talk about one thing we try and do with tools, because actually I think this is really important, and just as like a kind of lesson learned of our approach. We think a lot about tools building as reference design. What I mean by that is when you build something, you build it not only to fulfill a purpose, in this case to develop a tool that enables better creation of evidentiary data, but you also build it to advocate to bigger players to incorporate it. Because we know we're a human rights group, and we also know that that universe of citizen witnesses I described, all those people are unlikely to have downloaded a human rights app. How many people in this room, I'm assuming an assumption here that you all care about human rights, or else you just like Thai food. How many of you have downloaded a human rights app? Okay. Okay, wonderful, thank you. But it's a good assumption to make that a lot of people won't. So a lot of our effort we also put into trying to persuade mainstream technology platforms to build it in. Actually, what we're trying to frame this particular app out as at the moment is basically as an eyewitness mode that enables you to document things in a way that will be more trustworthy because you saw that fabulous twister and you want us to make sure that someone pays you for it, or your friends trust that it was actually real, or that in fact you had that fender bender that you claimed happened. So we often think about the commercial usage, not because we're a commercial entity, but because we're a human rights group that thinks if you speak to the human rights constituency and design for that, in a world where more and more people are part of this, they will not have access to the right tools there. Let me talk just about a couple of other challenge sets, and then I think I'll go to questions. So, huge one, safety, privacy, and consent. This is one that you constantly grapple against. And I think we have this dilemma, and this is not unique to the human rights realm at the moment, but you have this point of contradiction between privacy and data, right? It's the constant sort of discussion that happens in the context of any of the major platforms, our own interactions with Facebook, any of those kinds of things. And so we also think a lot about the sort of safety, privacy, consent dimensions. And I'm bundling those together, but actually some of those are technical concepts and some of those are more normative. Like I think consent is much more of a thing you try and engage people to think about, while safety and privacy are easier to build into tools as sort of fundamental design elements. let me illustrate why this preoccupies us. So this was an image from a website run by the Iranian, one of the branches of the Iranian militia after the Green Revolution, this thing called the Gurdab website, where they were looking on social media for the faces of people who participated in the 2009 Green Revolution protests, and sort of pinpointing them, putting them out for shame. I actually think this is a little bit of a red herring, you know, like, oh, we can all be found online or be identified by our governments, partly because these people are in public, and partly also because the Iranian government probably didn't need to crowdsource the identification of those individuals, given the nature of facial recognition and how you can use some of those tools. I also think that they're less at risk than, say, this person. One of the things that worries us a lot when we think about more and more people sharing stories, and particularly sharing stories with video, as it becomes more and more the kind of default way you have to kind of generate publicity. You know, if you don't have an image, don't have a video, people aren't paying attention. The people who get most vulnerable are the people who speak out as lone individuals. The whistleblowers, the single individual in a community. So it's not the 40 people in a crowd out in public, it's the one woman in, say, Zimbabwe, who in the upcoming elections speaks out about rape or sexual violence and says, look, I need to get this story out. I know that, you know, you're telling me that this sort of ecosystem requires me to share a story and probably to share it with video and photos nowadays. How do I do that well? And you can extrapolate that back, frankly, to almost any context of the lone individual. So we've been working a lot around that, and part of this is driven, as I mentioned, by the idea of facial recognition. I don't know if anyone ever came across this study. Actually, the visual there is not very helpful. I'm not really sure why I have that visual. But it's an interesting story, which includes this guy on the left, Alexander Acquisti, and a tool called PitPat. And essentially what he was able to do was, by taking photos of people in a public space in a college campus, I don't believe it was Stanford, he was able to match a statistically significant number of them to Facebook profiles. Now the interesting thing about this is not that he was able to do this with facial recognition, but he did it with a very, you know, a tool that could easily be incorporated at a commercial level and used peer-to-peer. So the realities of facial recognition are very close in terms of being able to identify our single, our almost unique identifier, which is our face, to the one act of, say, civil disobedience we do. So that woman in Zimbabwe, 99.9% of her life is as a farmer. 0.01% of her life, and probably a part that she doesn't want to be constantly connected, is related to the election violence that took place. So how do we think about that balance? This is a really tough one, particularly if we start to think about more and more tools to film, like Google Glass, things like that. How do we think about the way in which we may be connecting the one time someone does something unpopular, says something unpopular, does something courageous, to the 99% of their identity, which for most of us is normal every day, and how do we deal with that? That's a significant issue. I was joking before, and I think it was Clara, there are some solutions that are like this. This is the wonderful project by Adam Harvey, which basically looks at how you fool facial detection with great hair. I encourage you to try it. I think for the moment you may stand out for the hair, but in the long run, if we all do this, we will beat facial detection. Again, we try and think of this from a tools perspective. We built a tool called Obscura Cam that basically enabled you to blur faces on your mobile phone as you filmed. And then we also spent time advocating to YouTube to ask them to build in a similar function on their platform. And again, I think there's this interesting dynamic we need to think about now of how do we think about those big commercial spaces and how they interact with the ways in which human rights actors are trying to create human rights change, and the people who are doing that, who may not have been the people who did it before, or may just do it once. Like there's that incredible power of the one-time witness, the person who only ever filmed something once. A good example would actually be the person on the Oakland BART who filmed the shooting of Oscar Grant, right? That was someone completely accidentally. They will not probably film something again. There's that tremendous power in that, but how do we tap into that? It's not the people who will have downloaded the human rights app, had the human rights training. And that falls into this category of what I described here. Sorry, it's got a little bit cut off at the edge there, of those unseen protagonists. This is a great visual from the Egyptian revolution. It says, "Thank you, Facebook," or words to that equivalent. I don't think it was a put-up job. I actually think they said that. But we need to think about the role of Facebook and YouTube and others, Twitter, in protecting fundamental rights to freedom of expression and privacy. the context I would put that in is this, which is, this is a great quote by Ethan Zuckerman, who some of you may have come across, teaches at MIT, has a new book out actually, which looks great, called Rewire, which kind of summarizes a lot of his thinking. And he has this quote, which I think for me really captures it, particularly as someone who as a teenager grew up around Palo Alto and used to spend a lot of time at Stanford Mall, is that you wander through and it looks so peaceful and quiet. It looks like a great place to hold a rally because everyone is walking through. It's not. It's obviously not public space. And YouTube is a little bit like that. Looks like a public space. It feels riotous, significantly more riotous than Stanford Mall, frankly. But it's largely premised on a set of rules that are not transparent and on a basis that is about protecting, of course, Google and YouTube's shareholder value, not our rights to public speech. A couple of things that we've been working on engaging with companies, and I've mentioned a couple of them. That citizen witnessing mode, how do you think about making that available to more and more people to be part of a documenting ecosystem? How do you support within a platform how people think about things like consent and tools and literacies there? How do they be transparent about the decisions they make, and how do they think about privacy right from the start? So as we look at Google Glass, what would that mean for privacy at this point? I think I'll stop there and take questions, because those are really the sort of three key areas I think we have to address. And I can share ideas about next, if we run out of questions.
Okay, super. So there's a lot that you packed into that presentation. So I hope there are different synapse and neuron firings that lead us to raise interesting questions. We have, a little over 10 minutes. So have we got a mic, or we're just going on the ambient mic? Okay. So questions, thoughts, comments? Yes.
I had a couple of questions come up. One is that I had a student last quarter who, in a class about violence and nonviolence, who decided to develop a project where on social media and its use in nonviolent movements, focusing on the Green Revolution in Iran. And he's building a website, and he wants to make it real. He's calling it the Amplify Project. To me, it looked like a great idea and wonderful original idea on his part, but probably other people are out there already doing this. You already talked about some of the things that so what should I refer him to?
Probably depends exactly which sort of element of amplification. I think that's a huge challenge, and I actually think there's no great solution right there. So I would actually, one thing you might want to look to, and actually it's open right now, is there's actually IDEO, if people know that, sort of like a design challenge firm, has a whole set of challenges that are around human rights and technology, and how we do things like early warning, but also how we amplify stories. And it's an interesting community because it's bringing together a lot of people who have ideas around that. So actually a good step for him would probably be to step into that community. And actually others might want to look at it, because there's a lot of interesting ideas there around how do we think of this intersection of technology at the service of movements and human rights, which I've always got to get that balance right, of like where the technology fits, like it enables networks, it enables warning, it enables action, but how do we make sure it's in service of genuine modes of activism?
So it is still in rudimentary stages of people trying to make this happen.
Yeah. So I would put it out there, and certainly feel free to put him in touch with me as well. We're obviously interested in those kind of ideas as well.
You talk about the importance of contextualizing these videos and also verifying them, I guess, in a way, and finding their accuracy. Do you also see the, let me see the best way of this, that like the growth of a global market and images of suffering?
Yeah.
Do you see any kind of blowback? Because like, obviously a way to legitimate any kind of social movement is through, images of suffering.
Yeah.
And like you had, like in Bosnia, you had the staging of food shortages and stuff like that. Do you see more of that happening now?
Yeah, I think there's two layers to that. One is there's still like a kind of ecosystem of how NGOs in ethical but somewhat consumerist ways try and promote their particular issue. And that's, there's a long history of discussion of that, which definitely you see. And I think there is a challenge of how issues that are not so easily visual or sound-biteable communicate around that, which is not new, but I think it's exacerbated now because it's much easier to generate videos. That's not unethical. It's just like the sort of the marketplace of images, which Clifford Bob, who wrote, I think in the 1990s, wrote a lot about this kind of like, why do we care more about Tibet than Xinjiang or the Uyghurs, et cetera, like each of these contrasts. There is a literal marketplace that is out there in some specific things. So, really horrendous videos from Syria, for example, shot by the Syrian army do get sold. There is a literal marketplace for horrible imagery that is out there. So there is both a kind of sort of the legitimate but, challenging marketplace of how particular ideas find traction and what type of images need that, and then there is an actual marketplace around some particular issues. It'd be interesting to see how that might evolve as you have more and more. And there's obviously a sort of a shadow market, which is the sort of shadow market that's around snuff, things like that, that exists in a whole different realm.
But do you see that changing politics in any way?
I don't know if it changes politics. I think there's always been a shadow market in imagery.
Yeah.
So that shadow market I'm less worried about. Like, there's always going to be certain people who want to look at horrible images. In terms of the first one, I think we've got to do a better job of working out how we amplify the ones that are less visual, that are less... So our policymakers are not solely influenced by the ones that have volume. So I think the volume element is new. Like, we could have 300,000 videos from Syria. Does that influence how we do good policy making? Does it mean we prioritize Syria over, say, Central African Republic? So I think there is a question there about volume and how it gets funneled that is new. I don't think there are necessarily good solutions there. Yeah. Yeah.
I was wondering whether you guys have come up with any type of solution for information overload, but mainly how to get attention from an anonymous global society, right? So you're doing great work training activists to take these situations and go out with a camera and get these wonderful images. And for us who work in the human rights movement, it used to be the case that we would put out a written report until we realized that there was an overproduction of those reports, and they said, well, the way to get attention is through shooting a video. But now everyone is shooting a video, and now they're doing how to get attention without going through the usual intermediaries.
Yeah. So I stop before I talk more about skill sets and kind of what are the key skills. I often try and separate into kind of the skill sets for people who are kind of the witness, like the citizen witness, the kind of curators, and then the people who are involved in strategic advocacy, because I think there's different, they're interlinked. For witness, we start actually from very much like our training point of view is don't think about the broadest audience. Actually try and think very much about specific audiences, but mainly because our experience is like throwing stuff out into the global kind of like marketplace is pretty hard, and most things don't get traction. So even when we're talking about tactical skills, which would be things like how do I make my video more trustworthy, how do I make it so that the narrative is coherent, how do I protect the people in it, you also want to say to people, well, think about who your audience might be around this. Like, are you trying to like make the case to people who are sympathetic to or non-sympathetic? Are you trying to make the case to your neighbors or your country folk or to the Russians, if we looked at, say, Syria or something like that? So even at that level, it's worth thinking strategically. And then as you go higher up, we focus a lot on really targeting to specific audiences. And I think most of human rights advocates at this point, when it comes to video, needs to think in exactly the same way we think about advocacy generally, which is there are times when we're trying to sort of generate groundswell, which is when you use mainstream media and try and get those stories, but a lot of it is about very targeted work. And video and multimedia should fit in that paradigm for most organizations. So as we move up that value chain, we tend to move to that position. That doesn't mean it's uncomplicated, but it does mean it's easier to think, well, okay, are we trying to gather a strong base of evidence for a criminal prosecution? Are we trying to gather evidence for material for community organizing, all those sort of things, and then stepping through the process? And that's largely been what Witness has done for the past 20 years, is focus on that sort of strategic advocacy side. Now we're trying to think more and more about the people who can now contribute to that, but maybe didn't in the past. Yeah.
So I have a question that follows onto Seth's question, and it also ties in, or I hope it ties in to the presentation and discussion by Ken Roth a few weeks back. And that is, Seth talks about those of us in the human rights movement, our key advocacy tool was the report. And it might be more of a legal case, or it might be a report written by a group like Human Rights Watch, et cetera. And those sorts of reports through mainstream media, known sources whose credibility can be verified or is believed to be verifiable. And so the transition from, say, written reports to we'll make videos, say like Coney 2012 or not,
Yep.
Depending on your assessment of the Code of 2012 video itself. But still it seems that a lot of the dynamic is the same, and that is that there are images, there's information, maybe a lot of information, and then there are arbiters, or there are gatekeepers. And if those gatekeepers take the relevant information, frame it in whatever medium that is, and put their seal of approval on it, and their access to even better seals of approval, right? So Human Rights Watch can, because Human Rights Watch get the seal of approval of the New York Times or Le Monde, and then what it says will have consequence for global actors, et cetera. It seems as though that methodology continues to be relevant, but I'm wondering if you look into the future. We tried to get Ken to address this, and I'm not sure you wanted to engage in this discussion to the same extent that you might, but I could be wrong. If we look into the future, do you see a breakdown of that methodology? And if you do, what do you see? And are we going to have a truly atomized global human rights community where if you're Human Rights Watch, you don't get a leg up on the human rights group on the corner in a particular neighborhood in Kigali?
Yeah, I think there's elements of both. Like, it's clear that like sort of strategic advocacy models that have existed in the past still to some extent work. Particularly like if you're like Human Rights Watch, which has been able to do that for 20 years, you know, there's an incumbent advantage. I don't think that's a model that's so useful for other groups because of the nature of the way the media landscape is changing as well, and the number of those. I think there's a couple of things I think are important. One is there's going to continue to be kind of gatekeepers, but I think they're going to diversify, and I think they're going to look more like, hopefully not exactly like the three people I showed, who all seem to be 30-something men. Right. I hope curators, but I hope there are more people who can create trusted ways in which they gatekeep information that don't necessarily rely going through a Human Rights Watch or even a formal human rights group. Like, I actually think there are enough human rights issues that we already know, like the sort of selecting down process that happens on that. The second is the peer-to-peer model of how human rights momentum and attention is gained. I think there is something there about the way in which tools enable people to self-organize. Like, obviously the early manifestations of that are things like the way in which some of the organizing happened on the Arab revolutions in Facebook and Twitter, where it's, you know, it's peer-to-peer, it's like generating momentum by being a productive member of an ecosystem that shares video, text, organizing to each other. I think there are models of that that are more global, that might take out the middle person in terms of generating momentum. One part of that is the increasing sort of real-time nature of how we create and share media. That it's quite possible to, you know, generate a virtual crowd of 1,000 people around an issue at a particular moment, and then how you use that momentum, and that people power in that moment. I don't think we fully worked out, but that doesn't require like the gatekeeper. It just requires a structure that allows people to generate people power, and you're seeing that in Facebook and Twitter. So I think there's a model there. I think there's going to be a continued hybridity between like a traditional strategic advocacy boomerang model,
right,
and those new forms.
Right. But there's probably a displacement of the former traditional buy-in with the...
Yeah, I don't know how fast the displacement is or whether the two may just coexist for a long time. Like,
maybe jobs for the graduates here, places like
I tell you what. Yeah, in the cruder sense, I think there will be jobs at Human Rights Watch. I don't know if there'll be jobs at all the other places. Like, Human Rights Watch always strikes me as a kind of special instance. It's like, you know, when you use a particular example of that, it's why when I train people, like when people think in that sort of methodology model, I'm like, don't go down that route, because there's only space for one or two Human Rights Watches in an ecosystem, and if we want a very plural ecosystem, you've got to start thinking about the other models, otherwise it's, yeah.
So we have probably time for another question. I don't know, Clara had her hand up, but you can choose. Maybe get both questions out and then a final comment.
Yeah.
In theory, we wrap up by 2.
Okay.
So you two, if you can throw out your questions.
Yeah. My question is about the relationship between the citizen witness work that you do and the narrative work that you do. I'm interested because I wonder if part of what the future is a change in the conception of narrative, or change in what kind of narrative works and what people understand about what is narrative.
Sure.
Mine is for, I think you talk about protecting the people that you're filming. Can you also protect the filmmaker.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Is there a space within an organization, either yours or others, that do that, like a Wikipedia slide?
Yeah. So I think there's two things. On the narrative side, I think on the one hand, with the citizen witness, you're trying to help them create units of narrative coherence, even if they're short ones. And what I mean by that is who, what, where, when, why. Like, you do want to encourage, even at the most micro level, that those units of narrative coherence, people create them. And I think that's a key skill. Like the amount of shaky cam footage where you're like, wait a second, show me what happened, show it what happened. Like, so there's that. I think there is a way of presenting volume of video as narrative that involves lots of sources. There is not a good model right now for like that curation of video particularly. I don't think a playlist is a good model. I get frustrated with the YouTube channel because I don't think a playlist is the right way to do it. I think there will be better ways for us to present video. I just don't know what they look like quite yet. I think some of them are about multiple videos in the same space, where there's almost an exploratory way in which we experience video. And like then you have a cumulative effect of narrative. That works only for really space-based, like single location-based work. I'm not personally all that convinced by a lot of the transmedia that's out there that tries to sort of craft together a lot of pieces of single media. So again, I think we're in a transition point where there's real value to like strong narrative media. But thinking about how you curate, and then people find what's most relevant to them. That's the power of volume of media, is you can make it much more likely you'll find something that's much more relevant to you than the single narrative that tried to suit all audiences. On the filmmaker side, we historically have had a little bit of a prejudice towards the people who we think are more vulnerable, the people who actually can be seen in videos. And I think that's mainly a response to the fact that actually generally people have put emphasis more on the filmmaker side. There's a lot of sort of, protect the filmmakers, which is super important. So I'm not downplaying it, but in a sense we've always had a little bit of we know there's a risk to the filmmakers, but in the sense when you get stuck out in the world there, it's the face of the person who's being filmed who's often more vulnerable. I think there are interesting ways you can rethink the idea of things like peace brigades and stuff like that, like the way you provide solidarity around human rights activists that are about virtual presence and how do you have a lot of people waiting in case there's someone under attack. There's a recent project just launched in Stockholm called the Natalia Project, after Natalia Stemirova, which was basically like a bracelet for human rights activists that sends an instant alert to everyone's Facebook pages the moment someone feels under threat. So it's like trying to spread the kind of sense of urgency if there's an assault on an activist and very quickly. And I think some similar ideas apply to an activist filmmaker or someone like that. So I think there are ways to kind of try and structure responses, because the classic problem now is the structures for, say, human rights defender protection or journalist protection don't scale well for lots and lots of people, because they're dependent on getting people out of the country or getting them to an embassy or getting them support. And if we're talking about millions of people, that model doesn't scale well as a protection mechanism.
So on that note, I hope you all join me in thanking Stan and Gregory for.
And certainly if anyone wants to be in touch with me, I'm very easy to find, sam@witness.org. And take a look at the Human Rights channel, youtube.com/humanrights.
And vote.
And vote if you feel like it.
Exactly.